Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Down the Rabbit Hole with Alice Hatter. My name is Alice Hatter, and I was born and raised in New Orleans. Today's episode is titled A Spooky Hurricane Katrina Story. This story time takes place in 2005. If you didn't know, the city of New Orleans was flooded in 2005 due to Hurricane Katrina and the levee pilings not holding. If they would have set the pilings just a few feet further into the London Avenue Canal, the levees would not have broken. But the pilings were not set far enough into the ground, and the levees did break, flooding countless New Orleans neighborhoods. Gentilly got the deepest of the waters during Hurricane Katrina. There was a man by the name of Gerald who lived by the lake. He was a maitre d' at a famous New Orleans restaurant on Royal Street. You know, the one by the marble courthouse downtown. He and his son Dan used to live together. His son was 11 years old when Katrina hit. On August 28th, 2005, around 10 a.m., Mayor Ray Nagin ordered the first mandatory evacuation of New Orleans. Gerald's mind started racing. He checked his funds and mulled over the idea of evacuating with his son. He knew he didn't have anywhere to go, though. His only family was his son, and Dan lived with him. He had no amount of money to be staying in a hotel for, I don't know. I mean, Lord knows how long you're going to be in a hotel for a hurricane. His heart started racing. He knew he had to get gas and get to the store, and quick. Gerald and Dan headed to Rouse's into the Shell by UNO. The line for the Shell was around the block. He thought of going to Discount Zone in Lakeview, but he knew it wouldn't be any better there. He'd seen the lines for DZ before a storm. It's just as bad as the Shell. He decided to wait it out. He knew he wasn't leaving town, but he still wanted to have gas in the tank. It was like a false sense of peace of mind. After an hour wait to get gas at the gas station, the two were on their way to Rouse's to make some groceries and get supplies. Upon entering Rouse's, his son started questioning his father's decision to stay in the city for the storm. He was saying, "Why can't we just evacuate like everyone else, Dad? I mean, all my friends from school are leaving town. What if something bad happens and we're stuck here?" Gerald replied, "Son, we're not leaving New Orleans. This is our home. We have nowhere else to go. Can you afford a hotel room?" He questioned his 11-year-old son. Dan shook his head back and forth, replying, "Well, Dad, no, but..." He's like, "But okay then, neither can I. Zip it. We're here to get supplies for the storm, and you're complaining. We're going to ride it out, son. Everything's going to be okay. I wrote out every hurricane that ever hit New Orleans and its history, and I'm fine. Stop worrying. Help me prep. I'm going to teach you to survive a hurricane, boy. We need flashlights, batteries, candles, ice, lots of ice, and tons of water. We got to get a lot of water. Get canned food. You already know Entergy is going to fail us for some period of time, so we need to be prepared for the energy outage." The father and son team of two strolled through the aisles of Rouse's, collecting everything they needed to ride out the storm from home. The news kept saying mandatory evacuation, get out of town. Gerald had never stayed for one of those before. There'd never been a mandatory evacuation in New Orleans before Katrina. This was really the only thing worrying him in the back of his mind, was the mandatory evacuation and the fact that he wasn't going to leave for it. He'd stayed for every hurricane. What do you have to worry about? He didn't dare show an inch of fear or doubt to his son. Once arriving home, they began unloading the car and bringing in their supplies into the house. Everything on the TV and the radio was telling them to get out of town. Gerald turned the TV off. He couldn't take the constant reminder that he couldn't afford to get out of the city. Everyone at the restaurant was leaving town. But it was an off-tourist season, and working in the New Orleans restaurant industry, he very much relied on tourism, like many of the locals in New Orleans. He stood firm on his decision to stay. Being a single father of an 11-year-old was not inexpensive, and the means to get out of the city just weren't there. The night of August 28th, 2005, the father and son prepared their last meal in the kitchen of their New Orleans apartment. Gerald made him and his son muffulettas that night. It was raining lightly and the storm hadn't hit yet. The power was still on. After gobbling up a delicious muffuletta, the two brushed their teeth and hit the hay. The next morning, it was August 29th, around 6 a.m. when Gerald woke up. He woke up to the sounds of Hurricane Katrina creeping closer to the land of southeast Louisiana. The power wasn't on when he and his son woke up that morning. Over the next hour, wind speeds began increasing. He could hear it in the trees. It began to rain harder than Gerald had ever seen it rain in New Orleans over his 56-year lifespan. Things started to get even worse around 7:30 a.m. It had been raining all night. The electricity wasn't on. Things were not so great. It was hot, but, they still had ice. The pair had some Pop-Tarts for breakfast, but around 8 a.m., the water started coming in through the bottoms of the cracks of their doors. Not only to the front door, but also to the back door. Shh! Gerald raced to the doors. He looked at his son. We forgot sandbags. We forgot to set sandbags. We need to find something to keep the water from coming into the house. His son stood there, stared at him without making a word. Gerald could see the fear in his face. Gerald raised his voice at his son to make sure he was still functional. I mean now. The water kept coming in through the doors. They found some boxes, but those were just going to get destroyed like everything else. They had nothing even close to what a sandbag could do. I mean, they tried to put some towels down, but that didn't help at all because they just got wet and floated to the living room. As the dirty flood water started rising into their home, within a 30-minute period, the water went from outside to 2 feet deep inside their apartment. The two were wading around in water, trying to find something to stop it from coming in. This no longer made any sense to Gerald. They needed to find higher ground. The water in the apartment was almost up to the windows in the living room, which were about 3.5 feet from the ground. We need higher ground. We need to get to the attic. Gerald made his way through the murky floodwaters, devouring his home and everything he had ever worked for. He and his son finally made it to the kitchen, where the attic door was easily accessible from the ceiling. They pulled down the attic door. Gerald unfolded the ladder into the murky Katrina floodwaters that were in his kitchen. The water was still rising, and there was no sign of it slowing down. He got Dan onto the ladder and into the attic. They both made their way to higher ground, which at the time felt like safety. There was no getting through to anyone by phone. 911 wasn't working. No calls, for that matter, were going through. They didn't even have a chance to grab the supplies to put in the attic with them. Gerald could not explain how the water was rising so quickly into his home. He never experienced this before, and he had stayed for every hurricane that ever hit New Orleans. Gerald felt an immense amount of guilt for not leaving. No matter how much money he did or did not have, they would have been better off driving the car to Mississippi and sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. He beat himself up. Why didn't he just leave? How could this be happening? He looked at Dan. He said, "Son, I'm so sorry. It's never happened like this in my life. Something's wrong." His eyes began to quickly fill with tears as he looked back at his father. They hugged each other and cried. They sat in the 105-degree attic, holding each other, until they heard the glass from the windows in the living room start to crack due to the pressure from the rising water. It had been maybe 5 hours of rising water and unbearable heat in the attic. There were a family of rats in the attic with them. They had no water and they had no food. Gerald knew no matter how hungry they got, if they decided to eat one of those rats, a live city rat, that, in fact, would be the death of them. It just wasn't an option to eat one of the rats in the attic. He knew the two were dying, but he told Dan. Dan and Frank was trapped in an attic for 2 years. We're gonna be fine. Dan started to realize they were dying too. If his dad was trying to calm his nerves, he knew they must be in serious trouble. A full day in the attic had gone by and no one came to help them. It had been over 24 hours of sitting in an infested attic with over 100-degree heat. Gerald started to lose it. He started screaming, "Help! Help! Help us!" He went to bang on the roof of the attic. "Help us! Help us!" Then he realized he forgot. There was a vent at the front of the house, in the attic. He could punch out the vent in the front of the house. How could he have forgotten that? Maybe it was the heat or the lack of food. I don't know. He began crawling to the front of the house, towards the vent. His son followed him, crawling on the attic rafters. He reached the vent where Gerald was able to kick the attic vent out. Getting the attic vent kicked out was like receiving a shot of steroids from a doctor they both desperately needed. What they saw when they got the attic vent kicked out was proof enough that they were both going to die and no one was coming to save them. They were able to get a bird's eye view of their neighborhood. The neighborhood Gerald spent his entire life in, and the neighborhood Gerald proudly raised his son in, was completely underwater. The water was up to the eaves of the houses in his neighborhood. In fact, they couldn't see ground anywhere. Just water. All they could see was their flooded city and no hope for survival. As the last hours of their lives passed them by, they sat together by the newly opened vent in the attic. They watched the waves of the water splash back and forth against the neighborhood homes. It was an unreal sight. The two had cuts and scrapes all over them from having to crawl around the attic. They felt a sense of lost time, not sure how long they'd been in the attic for. They were crippled with heat and stress exhaustion. It was the 4th day of being trapped in the attic by the open vent. Gerald went to wake Dan, but he got a lifeless response. He checked his son's pulse, and there was nothing there. "Dan!" screamed Gerald. "Dan! Dan, please wake up. Come on, Dan, please wake up. Gerald was shaking his son's dead body to wake up and broke down in tears while holding his son's corpse and rocking it back and forth. Everything they had been through together, everything was over. It was all ending. It was all ending like this because he didn't want to leave town. How could this have happened? In the past, the city would flood, but I mean, never like this. Never been trapped in an attic. In the past, Gerald grew much weaker very quickly. He was already dangerously dehydrated and malnourished. 4 days in an attic that's over 100 degrees will do that to a person. Gerald knew it was only a matter of hours until his body stopped working like his son's. He held his dead son's body while he cried himself to death. It was not until 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina that search and rescue teams were able to enter Gentilly. Gerald and Dan's decaying bodies sat in the attic of the home they rented for up to 5 weeks before anyone was able to remove their bodies from the home. The home sat flooded and decaying until 2009, when the owner of the home finally received road home money to rebuild the home. The landlord of the property at the time was like many New Orleans landlords. New Orleans is known for having a bit of a slumlord problem. Road Home was a government program that provided funding to rebuild the homes after Katrina. It is said that the house that Dan and Gerald used to live in and died in, it was renovated. The owner of the home was in charge of rebuilding at the minimum of 4 other properties at the same time. You try rebuilding 4 properties at once. The owner also loved taking extravagant vacations. It's believed that the owner of this home did the bare minimum when renovating it after Katrina. The owner of the home made the inside of the living quarters look, nice enough. Nice enough to pass an inspection from Road Home. But to cut corners so they could afford another vacation, they never gutted the attic. The owner of that home never gutted the attic where 2 people died. And to this day, the remains of whatever was left after 4 to 5 weeks of rotting flesh in a 100-degree attic after a national disaster remains. And whatever remains are in that attic are attracting rodents, mice, and cockroaches to this day. As a New Orleans native, it breaks my heart to hear and see the ones in power ruin any chances the city had at successfully rebuilding environmentally safe homes for renters. And people wonder why the mental health crisis across America has gotten so much worse over the past decade. If you do not own a home, good luck finding an apartment in New Orleans that's been rebuilt properly and provides a safe living environment for tenants under $1,000. Even over $1,000, I guarantee you're going to get mold in this city. Many of the landlords after Katrina pocketed the road home money and used it for vacation rather than its purpose of rebuilding environmentally safe homes for renters. But until next time, everybody, thank you for tuning in to this spooky Katrina story.